Before we get started today, are questions over the homework?
More is like brand new boots. Got paint all over my brand new boots. Brand new. I know, so that shoulders up there, stuff.
You should get super boost.
Yeah.
And then just take the piece of something and put it over.
Questions on the homework before we get started? All right, so the first thing we're going to be doing today is picking up where we left off, because with 3-3, the first thing we started off doing is solving by graphing. Because we can graph these functions here, and whenever they cross the x-axis, whatever values of x makes the y be 0, whatever value of x makes the y value be 0, are our solutions. And we went through these here. And we did find that some of them, like this one here, didn't give us a solution, no real solutions, which really kind of told us that graphing does work, but not on all quadratics. It works on some, but not all. It also means that factoring works on some of these, but not all of these. So factoring and graphing work on some, but not all of them. The new method that we learned was the square root method. And the square root method had 3 steps. Thank you. The first step is to get the squared term by itself.
May I have your attention? May I have your attention, please? I need the following students to report to room 10. Taylor Tyson, Alan Tyson, Shaylee Swallinger, and Vince Menard.
And these are our 3 steps. First step is to get the squared term by itself. Second step is take the square root of both sides. And the third step is solve for x. So really solve for the variable, whatever the variable is. Now, with these here, the main reason or main way that we know that it works is we don't have an x term, x to the first powered term, that doesn't have a square somewhere with it, either being applied directly to it or inside a set of parentheses being squared. So here, since there is no middle term, that x term by itself, we can use the square root method, because our only variable that we have is x squared. So the first thing we need to do with this here is to get the squared term by itself. Well, there's 2 things with our squared term. We have the -9 and our multiplication of 3. So what can we do first? We can add the 9. Because our -9 plus 9 will be 0. And it'll tell us that 3x squared is equal to 9. At this point here, we're going to divide both sides by 3. 3x squared divided by 3 would be x squared, and our 9 divided by 3 would be 3. Yes? Questions on this here? Did we get the x squared term, or the term being squared by itself? Yes. So we can move on to step number 2. We need to take the square root of both sides. And the square root of x squared is x. equals. Whenever we take the square root or an even root of both sides, we have to put a plus or minus. Now we need to figure out what the square root of 3 is. 1.7 going on and on and on. Or we can just leave it as square root of 3, because that's as simplified as it gets without turning it into a decimal. Because if we can leave it in simplest radical form, we'll leave it in simplest radical form. Now x is by itself. We've already solved for it, so we are done. So for this here, the solution is plus or minus the square root of 3. Positive square root of 3 and negative square root of 3 are our two solutions for this here. Questions on this so far? So this here is nice because 3x squared minus 9, we can't factor it. It is factorable, but in order to be able to factor it, we need to really know the solutions to find the factors. We couldn't just pick the factors of 9 for this here and end up getting, I believe it's 3 squared roots of 3 and 3 squared roots of 3. It just wouldn't work well. Questions on this here? We ready for the next one? Okay, this one does look a little bit different, yes? But the steps still hold true because the only place where x is inside our parentheses being squared, yes? We can still use the square root method. The only time that this would kind of fall apart is if we had, say, 5 plus x. If we have x inside the parentheses and outside. Because if we have it inside and outside, well, we have to simplify that x plus 3 squared so we can get the x terms back together. But if the only x, the only variable is inside that parentheses squared, we can still use the square root method. Okay? Questions on this so far? Now, what was our first step? Get the squared term by itself. And there's a reason I said the squared term, not the squared variable. Because what is the squared term in our case here? The x plus 3, that whole term is being squared, yes? We need to get it by itself. So I'm going to rewrite this down below because we do have that letter C in front. Now there's two ways we can do this. One is that we can divide both sides by what? 2/5. And that would simplify out, yes? Or we can multiply by its reciprocal. What is the reciprocal of 2/5? Flip it. 5/2, yes? Because, I'll show you this in the calculator. 2/5 divided by 2/5 is indeed 1. They simplify out. Now what we have to start with is 2/5. If I multiply it by 5/2, we also get 1. Now if we're doing this without a calculator, it's easier just to flip it and multiply. And the reason I say that is because I could multiply this side by 5/2, multiply this side by 5/2, and we'd get our answer. If you have a calculator, we can divide 5 by 2/5. We'll get to the same place. Because this here simplifies to 1, leaving us with x plus 3 squared. 5 times 5/2 is 25/2. Now, if we said 5 divided by 2/5, we get 25/2. If we do 5 times 5/2, we get 25/2. It doesn't matter which way we go, we'll get to the same spot. Does that make sense? Kind of, sort of. Does that make sense how we got there? It's just picking which one you see first. If you see the division first, use it. If you see the multiplying by the reciprocal first, use it. We get to the same location. Questions on this here? did we get the squared term by itself? Oh, yes. Even though we do have the x plus 3 is inside that square. We can't do anything with it yet. This is where solve for x comes in. Now the second part, we need to take the square root of both sides. Now the square root and square will cancel here, leaving us with x plus 3 is equal to plus or minus. We can't leave that fraction inside the radical. Now we can go to the calculator. Square root of 25 halves, it gives us a decimal. Now, if you remember back to Algebra 1, we can reduce it, but to reduce it and leave it in radical form, we had to split it up. We had to take square root of the top over the square root of the bottom. And the square root of 25 halves, or the square root of 25 over the square root of 2, comes out to be 5 square root of 2 over 2. Questions on how we got to this point here? Last step we need to do, we need to solve for x. We need to solve for our variable. And to do that, we're going to minus 3 from both sides. When we add or subtract, no matter which one it is, when we're adding or subtracting that number, especially when we have the plus or minus, we want to put that number in front of the plus or minus. As we're saying negative 3 plus the square root of 5 over 2, and negative 3 minus 5 square roots of 2 over 2. Questions on this here? Any questions on anything we've done so far? Is negative 3 and 5 square roots of 2 over 2, are they like terms? So negative 3 and 5 square roots of 2 over 2, are those like terms? No. And the reason they're not is not so much the fact that one of them's a whole number, or one of those is an integer and the other is a fraction. It's the radical. The radical is what's making them not be like terms, because what we're saying is we have 5 halves of the square root of 2. That's it. That's as far as we're going to take it. Because the only way to go further from this is to convert 5 square roots of 2 over 2 into a decimal, an approximate decimal, before we can add or subtract. So this is as far as we go. Now, if the second part, instead of it being 5 square roots of 2 over 2, is just 5 halves, then we can add, we can subtract, because they would be like terms. Questions on this here? Be ready for the next one. Let's look at another one of these here. 2/3 x squared plus 14 is equal to 20. We don't have a middle term still, so we can use the square root method. This here. So the first thing is to get the square root term by itself, or the square root term by itself. So what can we do first? We can subtract 14 from both sides, which will leave us with the 2/3 x squared by itself is equal to 20 minus 14 is 6. X squared, our squared term is not by itself, so what do we need to do next? We can divide by 2/3. Because our 2/3 divided by 2/3 will be 1, leaving us with x squared. And we need to do 6 divided by 2/3, or 6 over 2/3, which is 9. At this point here, we can do what? We can square root both sides. Because the square root of x squared is x. Square root of 9 is 3. But remember, whenever we take the square root of both sides, we have to put the plus or minus. So we get plus or minus this, plus or minus 3. X is equal to plus or minus 3. Questions on this here? We feel good about that one there. Now I'm going to pull the graphing calculator up. Because here, well, if we subtracted the 20 over, we got it equal to 0. We had 2/3 x squared minus 6 equals 0. At negative 3 on the graph, it is indeed 0, yes? And at 3, it's also 0. If we end up with integer answers, it means we could have actually graphed this. It also means we could have factored this. Questions on this here? Are you ready for the next one? Negative 2x squared plus 1 equals negative 6. Yes, we need to get our squared term by itself so we can subtract 1 from both sides, which will tell us that negative 2x squared is equal to negative 7. What would we do next? Divide by negative 2. And our negative 2x squared divided by negative 2 is going to be x squared. And negative 7 divided by negative 2 is just 7 over 2. The negative and negative make a positive. Now, I would leave it as a fraction because getting in simplest radical form is going to be easier to stay in that form if we keep it as a fraction than to try to go to a decimal. Because our next step is to square root both sides. Now the nice part is the square root of x squared is, well, x. Now finding the square root of 7/2, well, the 30xs will be helpful in this here. We take the square of the top over the square root of the bottom and get the square root of 14 over 2. X is already by itself. Our variable is by itself. So our solution for this here is positive negative square root of 14 over 2. Yes. Questions on this here? Positive or negative, plus or minus, because that term can be positive or it could be negative, so we use the plus or minus to signify that it is both positive and negative. Because the other way we could write this is that x is equal to square root of 14 over 2, and we'd also write that x is equal to negative square root of 14 over 2. But we can combine it into 1 with the plus or minus. Are you ready for the next one? Yes? All right. Two times x minus 4 squared is equal to negative 5. Since we do have a set of parentheses being squared, there's no variable other than that. We would divide both sides by 2. And that would get us x minus 4 squared is equal to negative 5 halves. Is the term being squared by itself. From here, we would square root both sides. Here, the square root and the square would cancel, telling us that x minus 4 is equal to plus or minus. So we need to figure out what the square root of negative 5 halves is. So on the calculator, we can break it up. Second square root of negative 5 over second square root of 2. And we get an error. So this here is an error. Now let's look at it. And we're going to be coming back to it, and it's mainly because of this part here. This square root of negative 5. So this here, there are no real solutions. Because we're looking for a number times itself. And here, we're taking the square root of a negative because we're wanting to multiply a number by itself and get a negative. Because a positive multiplied by a positive is a positive, because positive times positive is a positive. Negative times a negative is still a positive, yes? So there's no real way to get a number times itself and get a negative. We'll come back to this. Now, if I add 5 to both sides, then we get this equal to 0. 2 times x minus 4 squared plus 5. I'm going to graph it and see what we get. Because it was x plus 4 squared. X minus 4. I couldn't remember if it was plus or minus. Plus 5. Where does it cross the x-axis? It doesn't, so it has no real solution. We will, by the end of this chapter, be able to solve these, but at this point we do not have a way to simplify or find the value of the square root of negative 5 halves. There is a value, we just haven't found it yet. And 13. Questions on this here? Be ready for another one. X squared minus 4x equals 45. Factoring. So for factoring, we're solving by factoring. We need to get this equal to 0. Really, the only way that we have for solving so far that didn't have us equal it to 0 is, well, the square root method. All the rest, we need this equal to 0. So the first thing we need to do to get this equal to 0 is to, what? Subtract 45 from both sides. Because on the right-hand side, 45 minus 45 is 0. On the left-hand side, we'll get x squared minus 4x minus 45 is equal to 0. Next thing we need to do for factoring, because now we can start factoring this, is to find the greatest common factor between these three terms. And there's not one other than, yes. And there's not one other than 1, so there is no greatest common factor. So we move on to our two sets of parentheses with 3 spaces. Yes. To find the sign, we look at the third term. And since the third term is negative for us here, our signs are opposite. One of them is going to be positive. One of them is going to be negative. Now we need to find the factors of the first and third term. Factors of the first term. Factors of x squared are x and x. Now we do need to find the factors of 45. Well, 1 and 45, 3 and 15, 5 and 9. Those are our only three factors. Which one do we want to try first?
315.
3 and 15. And then we can check off to the side to just make sure we got this correct. X times negative 15 would be negative 15x. 3 times x would be plus 3x, giving us negative 12x. Is that the correct middle term we wanted?
So let's try 5 and 9.
5 and 9. And we can check again. X times negative 9 would be negative 9x. 5 times x is plus 5x. And negative 9x plus 5x is negative 4x.
Are we looking for negative 4x?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, negative.
Yep. So we did get. You're good. Yep. So that is the correct middle term. So, thank you. So we have two things multiplied together to equal 0. One of them must be 0. That's just our zero product property. So we're saying that x plus 5 is equal to 0, or x minus 9 is 0. So with x plus 5, we can subtract 5 from both sides, which will give us x by itself, telling us x is negative 5. Or here we can add 9 to both sides, telling us x is equal to 9. And that's it. Questions on this here? We're ready for the next one. Three x squared minus 5x equals 2. If we're going to solve this by factoring, we need to get this equation equal to 0. So we can subtract 2 from both sides, because on the right-hand side, our 2 minus 2 would give us 0. On the left-hand side, since there are no like terms, we have 3x squared minus 5x minus 2 is equal to 0. Unfortunately, there are no like terms between our three factors, or three terms. So we move on to our two sets of parentheses with three spaces. We're going to find the sign. Since the third term is negative, our signs are opposite, different. One is going to be positive. One is going to be negative. Our next step after that is to find the factors of the first and third term. Our first term is 3x squared. 1 and 3. So where do you want to put the 3? And our factors of x squared are just x and x, so we can go and plug those in. Factors of 2. 1 and 2. 1, 2. We can flip it, do 2 and 1. And then we can check here. X times negative 1 would be negative x. 2 times 3x would be plus 6x, giving us a positive 5x. is that the middle term we wanted? No. We need it to be negative. It is the correct number, but wrong sign. So we need to flip the signs. Because now x times 1 is going to be positive x. Negative 2 times 3x is negative 6x, which does indeed give us our negative 5x that we wanted. So at this point here, we have two things multiplied together to equal 0, so one of these must be 0. So either x minus 2 is 0, or 3x plus 1 is 0. So for our x minus 2, first thing we can do is add 2 to both sides, telling us x is equal to 2. And that's it for that part. But the 3x plus 1 equals 0. First thing we can do is subtract 1 from both sides, telling us 3x is equal to negative 1. And then we can divide by 3. It says that x is equals to negative 1. Questions on this here? And that leaves us with these last three, yes? So what is it telling us to do here? Find the zeros. Now this seems like this is going to be something different, because that's normally how it works out, isn't it? We get through most of it, then it changes at the end. No, finding the zeros, finding the solutions, finding the intercepts, finding the roots. We're saying the exact same thing. When we find the zeros, we're trying to find out what values of x will make the function be 0. And those are the zeros of the function. Now, besides that, it didn't tell us anything we had to do with it specifically. So we can try graphing. 2x squared minus 11x plus 12. So I can use the graphing calculator. Say 2x squared minus 11x plus 12. Well, it gave us 4, because 4 is the value of x that makes the function b, but it didn't give us another one. It only gave us 1. So that is nice, because we do know one of the two answers. But we're going to have to factor it to find the other. So let's go on and factor this and solve. 2x squared minus 11x plus 12. Is there a greatest common factor between these three terms? Well, no. 2 and 12, yes, but not 11. 2 sets of parentheses with 3 spaces. If the third term, since the third term is positive, the signs are the same and match the sign of the middle term. So we have negative and negative. Now we need to find the factors of the first and third term. Factors of 2x squared, well, we'll have x and x. 2 and 1. So 2x and x. Factors of 12. 1 and 12. 2 and 6. 3 and 4. Which one do we want to try first? Don't we know a solution already? Because what did graphing tell us one of the solutions was? So it might be 3 and 4. 3 in the first one, 4 in the second. So even though graphing didn't give us every answer, it did give us enough of a hint at what the factor should probably be. At this point, we can check. 2x times negative 4 is negative 8x. Negative 3 times x is negative 3x, which does indeed give us negative 11x. So those are the correct factors. Zero product property. If two things multiply together to equal 0, one of them has to be 0. 2x minus 3 equals 0, and x minus 4 is equal to 0. Well, the x minus 4, we can add 4 to both sides, and surprise, surprise, we find out that x is equal to, well, we already found that. We knew that from the beginning. But we do need to find our other value of x, our 2x minus 3. So the first thing we can do is add 3. Telling us 2x is equal to 3. Divide by 2. Telling us x is 3/2. So one of the solutions is 3/2, the other is 4. Questions on this here? I believe we have 2 left, yes? X squared minus 8x. And our 4x squared plus 28x plus 49. Well, let's look at this. Excellent. So again, just telling us to find the zeros. We can use any method we want. Oh. We can try graphing. Rest that out. So x squared minus 8x. Graph. So across to the x-axis at 2 places, yes? Second table. What's one of our values of x? 0. Because again, we're looking for what values of x make the y value be 0. 0 and 8. Those are the 2 values of x that make the y values be 0. And those are our 2 there. Now, if we were to factor this, because I do want to show you all this. In our factoring steps, looking at this here, our first step is to find what? A greatest common factor, yes? Is there a greatest common factor between 8x squared and 8x? There's not a number, but they do have x in common, yes? Up to this point, we haven't had one like this, but we can factor out an x, because they do share it in common with both terms, yes? It's factored. Because as soon as we don't have an x squared term, a term variable to a power, in any of the spots, this is factored. We factored the x out because it's common in both terms. And that is factored. That is as far as it goes. And again, we have 2 things multiplied together that equal 0, yes? So it's here saying that x is equal to 0, or x minus 8 is equal to 0, yes? Well, this first one, x is by itself already, yes? That one's done. The other one, we need to add 8, telling us x is equal to 8. So that one there, we could have graphed it or factored it. We get to the same location. Questions on this here? This is the last one, yes? f of x equals 4x squared plus 28x plus 49. Now, unfortunately, we can't necessarily use the graphing calculator because our solutions are rational. They don't give us nice integers. So we can factor this. Now, there is no greatest common factor between the three terms, so we're going to have our two sets of parentheses with three spaces. Since the third term is positive, the signs are the same and match the sign of the middle term, which is also positive. So I'll have plus and plus. Now we need to find the factors of the first and third term. With our 4x squared is going to be x and x. That's the only way we can factor x squared. Questions on this so far? Factors of 4. 2 and 2. 1 and 4, 2 and 2. Which one do we want to try first? 2 and 2. Factors of 49 are 1 and 49 or 7 and 7. We can try 7 and 7. And if we check this here, 2x times 7 is positive 14x. 7 times 2x is plus. And 14x plus 14x is positive 28x. Is that the middle term we wanted? Okay, so that is factored correctly. Questions on this so far? Questions on anything we've done so far? We feel good with this here. Okay. So at this point here, we can set both of these equal to 0 and solve for x. So I subtract 7 from both sides. And then divide both sides by 2, telling us x is equal to negative 7 halves. And the other one would be the same because we can subtract 7, telling us 2x is equal to negative 7. Divide both sides by 2, so x is equal to questions on this here. Questions on anything we've done so far today? That is it. That is it for 3.3.